Let us pray. Lord God of the nations, the issues that confront us seem to be inescapable and unavoidable. They hit close to home. Bomb threats in southern Ohio that close schools and universities. Women dying because of the lack of the health care that they require. Gun violence, whether on a golf course or at a school on the west side of Lansing, and a war that continues to expand in unfathomable ways in the Middle East. We are overwhelmed and exhausted and afraid. And so we give you thanks for this time, this place, this virtual table, which is a respite, an opportunity not only to learn, but to be refilled. We ask you to bless Pastor Amy and her team as once again they teach us that we may be inspired, empowered, and invigorated to proclaim your love. In Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Satterley, for praying us in. Hello, colleagues. Hello, friends. Hello, fellow disciples. It's good to be back with you. For those I haven't been with before, I'm Pastor Amy Reumann. I'm the Senior Director for Witness and Society in the ELCA. I'm delighted that tonight I'm joined by two colleagues, Karen Krieger, who's been part of all these sessions, our Program Director for Advocacy Engagement, and Pastor Kari Ryerson, who is our Program Director for Corporate Social Responsibility. She's our special guest and interviewee this week. As we talk about one of my favorite topics in the church, which is our social teaching as the ELCA. And but before we dive right in, quick recap about where we've been. In our first session, we dove into civic engagement as a church, how God calls us to it, how we serve our neighbor through it, and some of the ways that we can be involved both in terms of our discipleship and our ministries in an election year, and also how to do that within the law and guidelines, but also to do so boldly for the sake of our neighbor and our communities. Last week, my colleague Silas Kulkarni led an introductory session on depolarization and some of the first steps that we need to take. And it's a really important conversation in this season. And I think what was clear in last week's session is that we're not going to get through or on the other side of polarization in our communities just by pointing fingers at the other people who are the problem. That's not going to get us to a solution. As we say in the confession, if we say we have no sin, what? We deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And so what Silas's session helped us to see is that if we're going to tackle political polarization in our country, we start with ourselves by being attentive to what we have done or left undone to heed God's call to stay in community, to see God's vision, God's image in everyone, the Imago Dei that we talked about in the first session, to forgive grace, or to offer forgiveness and grace, to actively love and respect one another despite our differences. I want to say a few words about the title for this series. We could have called it something like Election Year Guidance for Lutherans, but we didn't. We called it Witnessing to Christ and Love for Neighbor in an Election Year. So let's unpack this because our starting point is not giving Lutherans or talking about what our election activities are. Our starting point is always God. And the nature of God and who God is for us and who God calls us to be. And so we want to ground our values, our behaviors, our choices and ministries in an election year, first and foremost in God's love as revealed in Jesus Christ. And to affirm that as Lutherans, we believe and we teach it's God's grace and God's love that frees us not just for our own individual lives, for our personal, private sphere, but frees us for a vocation to public life that witnesses to God's love and that enacts that love through seeking justice, peace, shalom, as we talked about it in the first session, and wholeness, not just for ourselves or our immediate intimate sphere, but for our neighbors. Of course, this is our call, whether it's an election year or not, right? But in these next weeks in our nation, with so many uncertainties ahead of us, leading up to an election, we already have been living with the vitriol of social media and the hot takes, the daily breaking news and headlines, sometimes the heartbreaking headlines, the fears and the realities of political violence, the anticipation, perhaps, of those strained or even shouted conversations at the Thanksgiving table. All of this is a challenge for us. And all of this is an opportunity for us to go deeper into our resources of faith and what it means to witness um, in this election year to God's love for us and our love for our neighbor. So, to take a moment with scripture. Remember when Jesus was asked to sum up all the commandments? Um, his response was, we all know this, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We call this the golden rule. It rolls off our tongues so easily. We know it by heart. We needle point it. We hang it up in our guest bedroom. It's short and it's sweet, and we say it almost without thinking about it as shorthand for what it is to be a disciple. But neighbor love is not easy, rarely convenient, or even terribly sweet at times. It's hard. It's hard work. It takes an effort. Just think of someone you know who's a little hard for you to love, and we realize how true that is. What's so extraordinary, though, in this exchange when Jesus is asked to sum up the commandments and give this answer, it's in the midst of when he's being tested by his arch enemies, the religious leaders. And one scribe brings this question to him: what is the greatest commandment, hoping to trap him. And Jesus' answer, I really only saw this more recently. It's not that Jesus is saying this to us, Jesus is actually answering his enemy um, when he says, loving your neighbor is the greatest commandment. And that includes the scribe who's trying to trip him up. It's the same thing that Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. And so loving the enemy is also neighbor love. So as we look at political polarization in our nation, in our communities, in our congregations, in our very families, we know we're not going to get it right if it's just a matter of our own will or intention, um, that we're not going to be able to do this on our own. Some neighbors are very, very hard to love. We can only love them because of God, who loved us first and who showers us with grace, making it possible for us to open our hearts to one another. So, this is a group enterprise and a community endeavor in which we need to support one another, including throughout your own synod. Martin Luther has a beautiful way of saying this. He said that we have to understand our belief as faith that is active in love. And that's expressed both through serving our neighbors' immediate needs, but also through seeking greater justice with and for them, including in an election year, which brings us to my favorite topic, social teaching. And social teaching, as I sometimes say, is our superpower. Social teaching is our superpower. What are we going to do today? So, we're going to look at why do we address social issues as God's people? What kind of social teaching and policy does the ELCA have? How does it get used? How do these documents get created? How are we accountable for them, to them? What are social messages and social policy resolutions, which are often not as well known as the social statements? And what are the differences between all of them? How can we use our social teaching, including during an election cycle? And with Kari here, what is corporate social responsibility and how is it related to social teaching? So, to set the table for this conversation, we need to talk about theological ethics, which is what our social teaching in the church is. Now, theological ethics may sound like something that only scholars with multiple degrees might engage in, but it's actually something we do on a daily basis as we make choices based on our faith and our interpretation of it. Let's start with St. Anselm. St. Anselm was an 11th century monk who made his way to England and eventually became Archbishop of Canterbury. He had an enormous impact on theology in his time and also in our own day. And he famously defined theology as faith seeking understanding. In other words, we don't check our brains at the door when we enter church or become a Christian. And faith isn't something just that we receive, but throughout our life, it's not one and done. Faith requires that we stay curious, we ask questions, we use the mind that God gave us, and seek understanding of God uh, to the best of our abilities. Next slide, please. So, my colleague Ryan Cumming in the Office of the Presiding Bishop introduced me to a great way to think about theological ethics, which is through cartoon strips. And some of the great theologians of the cartoon page are Calvin and Hobbes. If you didn't grow up with them, Calvin was a boy, and Hobbes is his stuffed tiger, named after a theologian reformer and a philosopher. And they are always wrestling with questions about the meaning of life, the nature of God, and their role in the world. So, if theological ethics is faith seeking understanding, in this first cartoon, we have Calvin questioning whether there is a God. Pause and think about it for a while. And without an answer, Calvin says, well, somebody's out to get me. Um, and in the second, we have Calvin who knows what's just happened, but he says it's hard to be religious when certain people are never incinerated by bolts of lightning. In both, he's questioning the nature of God, his relationship with God, and staying curious, asking those questions, engaging in theological ethics. As Lutherans, we are questioning people too who use our minds to ask who God is and how God is acting. One of the ways I love that God is described, or that this is described, is in Dan Erlander's book, Baptized We Live, where he talks about faith as a way of seeing. Um, and faith as a way of seeing means that uh, we look at the suffering of the world and we see something not distanced or removed, right? But we see the cross of Christ right there. And that we are called not to blink or to look away, but to move towards that. It's also a way of seeing and where we see the resurrection in places where there seems to be hopelessness, knowing that as Christ rose, Christ calls us to be part of communities seeking and enacting resurrection in our own ways. Uh, the other thing about theological ethics is that it can be intimidating until you're realizing it's not about getting things right. Here are some more theologians in the comic strips, Snoopy and Charlie Brown. I hear you're writing a book on theology. I hope you have a good title. I have the perfect title. Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? Theological ethics is about uh, knowing that we may not get it right. We use our reverent best guesses, as a friend of pastor of mine used to say. Um, but it's not about uncertainty or convincing others. It's our response of gratitude to God's grace, where we've been set free to ask questions, to seek shalom, to get it wrong sometimes, and to learn from that. But particularly to take our place where God is suffering alongside other humans and creation. On to social teaching in the ELCA. So, social teaching in the ELCA, I think this is one of the best summary statements of it. It's from the very first social statement, ELCA, Church and Society, a Lutheran perspective. It says, the witness of this church and society flows from its identity as a community that lives from and for the gospel. Faith is active in love. Love calls for justice in the relationships and structures of society. It is in grateful response to God's grace in Jesus Christ that this church carries out its responsibility for the well being of society and the environment. This is the what of what we do. Um, that witness flows out of the gospel. It's this faith active in love, direct from Luther, that then calls for justice in relationships and structures. It's our response in faith for the grace that we have received, and it's a responsibility that we carry forward. This is the what. The next slide is the how. Also in the same document, that this church is to be a community where open, passionate, and respectful, that's quite a combination, right? To get right, deliberation on challenging and controversial issues of contemporary society is expected and encouraged. Um, Maybe try this sentence out in your congregations and see if how well known this is. Expected and encouraged. Uh, that this is what we are called to, and do we recognize ourselves in this description? The ELCA is a church that we encourage lively conversations about tough issues. Because we believe we are justified by God's grace on account of Christ, we can talk about the hard things. We can share contrasting perspectives. Our most asked for resource in our witness and society work, it's not the individual issues, it's how can we talk together across boundaries, across perspectives, across parties, cross policies. Um, and we do, and we have a way to describe this for ourselves as a church is that we are a community of moral deliberation and that we can dare risk doing this because the basis is not our social identities, our political identities, it's our identity as a community in Christ. The other thing I want to say about our social teaching documents is that they are not confessional litmus tests. They are not uh, uh, you don't have to agree with every word in them, and in order to be Lutheran. But what they do is they put into writing faith-based thinking about social issues that guide us as individuals, as communities, and in the public work of our church. They think through for us from the perspective of faith how to discern God's call to be people who love our neighbor. Karen, could you read these purposes of ELCA social teaching and policy?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And there's a grouping here of 6. What are the purposes of ELCA social teaching and policy? To present an overall moral vision of this church, to provide frameworks and content for moral discernment and judgment, govern the institutional witness of the ELCA in society, offer vocational guidance for everyday callings, supply the basis for advocacy on social, economic, and political questions, and fund moral formation within the teaching function exercised by seminaries, congregations, and so on.
Thank you. So there's this overarching moral vision that all the documents together provide. And at the very end, we're going to look at them. There's a lot of individual topics, but what do they present all together as one cohesive whole? Towards that image of shalom that we talked about in the first session, of this state of peace and sufficiency, and that the image of God being recognized and valued in everyone. They provide these frameworks for moral discernment, where we can discuss together, where we can look not just at our own individual experience, but see the big picture and the systemic picture of systemic ills and talk about how to dismantle them. It governs the institutional witness of the ELCA, so the advocacy work that the Witness in Society team does, we are bound, we are limited by social teaching, and we are also freed by it. I'll talk about that a little more later as we get into some of the issue-based, but if we don't have social teaching, we cannot advocate on something on behalf of the ELCA as part of the institution. Social teaching also underlies the public statements of the presiding bishop as a foundation for public messages. And we may have time to look at a video of her a little bit later on. Vocational guidance for everyday calling. I know someone who became a Lutheran because of social teaching, because he found in it an expression of a thoughtful approach to the issues of the day that he personally wrestled with, and a vision and uh, uh, an image and a sense of God who really cared about human suffering, the groans of creation, and the call to address that together. It's basis for our advocacy, and then for the moral formation within the teaching function in seminaries and congregations. What I do know from my own seminary training is I think we had one class in my ethics course on social teaching. I don't know if others have had more robust opportunities to do that. But we're often trying to catch up once we get into other ministries after, for those of us who have theological training, of how to use it and immerse in it. Um, Also within the moral formation and within the teaching, we also know we have Lutheran affiliated agencies and institutions that use it. I know a little while ago when the Lutheran hospital system in Omaha, they were restructuring, and so they studied the ELCA healthcare statement for guidance on what their health ministry could look at. Or I also heard that at Susquehanna University, in the ELCA affiliated university in Pennsylvania, their freshman reading for the first semester was the Statement on Economic Life. So when I say these documents are our superpower, what I simply mean is they provide us with rich and deep resources that are rooted in scripture, in our confessions, and in theology that can guide our choices, our questions, and our participation in an election year as well as not in an election season. It means we don't have to start from scratch on many of the issues we care about that are going to be showing up on the ballot locally, state, and nationally this year, whether it's the environment, education, foreign aid, food and nutrition programs, healthcare. We have teaching that can help us think about the platforms and the proposals that are coming. Um, it's our superpower because we're a church that's dedicated to wrestle with these issues. we Social teaching doesn't dictate what we may think as individuals, but we are invited to give them serious consideration as we form our own judgments. Um, and social teaching also addresses the role of the church in society. For example, in the peace statement, there's a wonderful segment that talks about the church as being four different things at once. The church is a disturbing presence that names and resists idols of false security, that things that lead to injustice and war, that elevates our nation or any people to the role of God. So it's to disturb things when things like that get out of whack. It's to be a reconciling presence, to seek peace and community and create bonds in conflict. The church is to be a serving present and to serve others, including through advocacy for justice. And the church is to be a deliberating presence. So all of these things at once are not a lot of, we don't see these very often in our society. We may see one or the other. You're either serving or disturbing. You're either deliberating or you're not. So social teaching helps us to see our church big picture. It helps us to make some of these decisions in an election year about how we are going to engage, who we're going to engage with as we seek what our witness will be. I'm going to pause right now and see if there's any questions, comments, concerns.
Yeah, it looks like we do have one question in the chat. I think it's just a clarifying, what does it mean to fund moral formation?
I think that should not be fund.
It was from the slide, but I had a feeling it was a typo.
It is a typo. I can look up the exact verbiage. It's not form moral formation, further for moral formation. It's something like that. Thank you. Okay, let's move on. So next slide is, what kind of documents exist and what do they cover? So there's three main kinds of social teaching documents. The first are social statements, which are what most people think about the social teaching of the church. And these are broad frameworks that help us to think about an issue in the context of life and faith. These also set policy for the ELCA and guide our advocacy and our public church work. These are adopted by the churchwide assembly. The second kind are social messages. These are narrow, more focused, usually on one specific topic. We'll be looking at some of these in just a minute. They're built upon the existing social statements. They don't bring something new in, but they are able to focus and drill down into something there wasn't perhaps space or a call to do in an earlier social statement. And then there are social policy resolutions, which are very specific actions or policy commitments of the ELCA that are adopted either by the church council or the churchwide assembly. I think of these, the relationships between statements, messages, and resolutions as sort of a building blocks that children may make. The largest block is on the bottom. The foundation is a social statement. So here's our healthcare statement: caring for health, our shared endeavor. Built on the top of that is that there was then call for a social message around mental illness. And so, because that was not addressed in depth in the healthcare statement, there's a separate social message that built upon the theological confessional foundation in the social statement. And here's a social message. And then there are social policy resolutions. And so here's a very specific one calling for the church to work and take public policy action on HIV and AIDS. And so they build upon one another, but the resolutions and the messages cannot exist first without a statement. I do want to point out, because these are sometimes brought up and asked about how they relate to social teaching, is that we also have what are called practice-oriented social documents. And these are primarily called declarations that there's the Declaration to the People of African Descent here and to American Indian and Alaska Native people. These will bring in social teaching commitments, but they specifically both lament the church's inaction and sometimes complicity in ills and participation in systemic racism in U.S. history, and commits the church to particular actions. We also have strategies such as the Amparo strategy, accompanying migrant minors and migrants in the United States and globally, as well as the Samud strategy, which is our strategy on the Middle East. These incorporate social teaching, but they are not the same, but they are blueprints for action in the church. So just very briefly, these are some of the key characteristics. Social teaching documents, the statements in particular, these are theological documents, containing our best understanding of Scripture and our theological tradition. They are also teaching documents. They are meant to be used in seminaries and congregations for individual study, to equip us for our work in society. They are documents of theological ethics, the ongoing task, it says. So, we're back to faith, seeking, understanding, and Calvin and Hobbes. They help us discern what is God's will for today, and for guidance for action on how we could look at an issue and perhaps act on it. They are also, I'm not doing this in order numerically, am I? The result from an extensive, inclusive process. We're going to actually look at that process in a minute. They guide our institutional life, and they're meant to be widely used. And we can talk about why they're not always widely used, but some of the ways that I've seen that they have been very creatively and faithfully in congregations. So what statements exist? These are all available on the ELCA website, in the Faith and Society area. You can see when the church, ELCA was birthed, while there were predecessor bodies that had social teaching, we needed to come up with it as a united body. And so right off the bat, our foundational document, Church and Society, a Lutheran Perspective, adopted in 1991. And then two pressing concerns at the time for the church to speak to immediately were abortion and the death penalty. So that's an interesting snapshot of what was considered what was most needed at that time. followed quickly by caring for creation and freed in Christ, race, ethnicity, and culture, setting those commitments of the church. Peace in God's world is really deals with global peace and how we work in a concerted way globally for reduction in war and conflict and nurturing peace. Economic life, that's our workhorse statement. I think of it. It undergirds a lot of the advocacy work that we do. And then you can see healthcare, education. As these go on, there are no more multiple ones in a year. Resource-wise, we can only do one at a time. It's about a 5-year process. And they get fatter each time. They get more pages. Some of the earlier ones are quite slim. Human sexuality, genetics, faith, criminal justice, faith, sexism, and justice. And next up is civic life and faith. And we're going to look at that process in a minute. So then there are social messages. Recall they have to be built on the foundation of an existing social statement. This is only a sampling of some and when they were developed, from suicide prevention in 1999 to human rights in 2017. Pause for questions.
Let's see. Okay, we do have a question in the chat. It is about when the Churchwide Assembly decided to be a sanctuary denomination and where that kind of fits in. Is that like a social message or a declaration or a statement?
That was a memorial, as I recall. Was that 2019? That was the Milwaukee Assembly. I believe that was a memorial. I don't know if it came from one or more synods. And so the vote on the assembly floor, it was adopted that the ELCA become a sanctuary denomination. But when you look at memorials that are brought, usually in the whereases, why are we urging the Churchwide Assembly to take this action? There's social teaching in there. So, and that's a go-to place to find the grounding for why would we take this action. And that would be an interesting one to take a look at, actually. All right, next slide. All right, so how are social teaching documents developed? You may have seen on the social messages slide that there's one on suicide prevention. And here's one way social teaching happens, is that the nucleus or the initiation for this was the experience of a family in a congregation whose adult daughter committed suicide. And the parents went to their pastor and said, what does the church teach? In their grief, what can we learn? How can this provide us some direction, some guidance as they're struggling to understand this tragedy and loss? Pastor went to the synod and said, what is our teaching? And the synod there ended up bringing a memorial to the Churchwide Assembly calling for social teaching on suicide prevention. And so that social message was adopted and, is now part of the body of our social teaching and the basis for suicide awareness and prevention and ministry in the ELCA, as well as some of the advocacy that we do. So that is one way that it happens out of very personal experiences and ministry moments that point out the need for the church to have this. There's a document called Policies and Procedures of the ELCA for Addressing Social Concerns. This lays out the whole process of how to get a document and also how you revise a document when time passes and perhaps it needs to be updated. So all this is spelled out there. We're not going to go into it in too much detail, but that's available for you to consult. So what I think is important to say in the development of social teaching is that it is a communal practice. In the Roman Catholic Church, social teaching is developed by the Vatican. There are some very congregational church models where the pastor decides, what is our social teaching and belief? What we have in the ELCA is a communal process. It is not quick. It is time consuming, but it reflects our belief in the priesthood of all believers and the gifts and abilities and the depth of faithful individuals and communities across this church who can contribute all together. So we have this rather busy image here, but it shows some of the flow and the back and forth and developing of social teaching that involves the church council, which would have authorized development. It brings the members of the ELCA to become members of the task force that would then do the work, that would bring study and learn and debate, and then create learning documents for synod hearing and congregational input. And then it finally goes to the church council and then churchwide assembly. We're going to look at this in another way because this is impossible to read. So, but then here's this wonderful another way of looking at it, which is a social teaching document, and takes a pressing issue. It adds scripture, theology, social analysis, and brings that out into a social document. So let's look at the development using what's happening right now, which is creating a social statement on civic life and faith. So first, a social statement has to be authorized by the churchwide assembly. It usually comes through memorial. From one or more synods. It may be wordsmith on the floor, but if it's passed, then it comes into the queue to be made. We were only doing one at a time simply because of all the resources. A task force is seated by the church council. How do you get on a task force? There's a call for nominations, but it's very intentional to have diversity that is by region, by gender, race, people who are theologians, lay members. For this task force, there's people who are elected to statewide office. There's a lobbyist. There are activists. There's ethicists. There are people who are government employees, who are in the military, bringing rostered, not rostered. So a whole variety of skills and gifts that are in this task force, as well as the advisors who are there. The task force listens and studies listening sessions across the church, as many as can be offered and held, to hear from questions, what people want to see on the topic of civic life and faith. I'm an advisor to this task force. We've heard from experts in so many different areas, from religious freedom to campaign finance to the status of Puerto Rico, and many more things. We create resources for study, which then leads to a draft, which is currently out, which is still open for your study and comment and discussion. Comments can be offered through the formal hearing process, or you can just go online and offer your comments to this. Every comment is read, is weighed, and changes and shapes the draft based on what ELCA members and non-ELCA members. There's no requirement that you have to be an ELCA member to shape a final draft that will come before the churchwide assembly next summer. So the churchwide assembly will consider it. It may amend or make some changes in the text, and then needs to be adopted by the highest standard possible, which is a 2/3 vote. Finally, then they get used. And I know there's sometimes a feeling these documents get passed and they sit on a shelf, but there's many ways that they get used, not just in seminary and academic settings, but in congregations, both for individuals' discernment, for study about particular issues, for talking about the role of the church in society. I know in the youth gathering, I ran into a pastor who says he uses them with his confirmation class and youth group. His youth group, through 4 years, they work through many of the statements, as sort of the glue that holds together their devotional and study time. So what's the accountability of these documents? Why should we be accountable also to what's in them? It's because they've been tested in so many ways. Here's the same chart with all this stuff going on, but between the action of the church council, bringing in a diverse panel to help shape and carry this with diverse perspectives. I can tell you, for the civic life, people come from very different directions. but we do so with great love and respect for one another through this hearings, church council action, the task force. It's gone through so many revisions and uh, opportunities for the church at large to weigh in. Finally, when we look at our social teaching, there's themes and threads that we can find in it. You saw all those topics that are in the individual social teaching documents. But across them, there are 4 principles that show up over and over and over. And those are participation, solidarity, sufficiency, and sustainability. These are all in the economic life social statement, right? That kind of makes sense when you see some of these. They're all in care for creation. They also show up in human rights and the one on the social message on climate change. And so in election year, these are things we can listen for in the policies that are proposed. We can watch for in the behavior of candidates and campaigns. We can model them in our own conduct. Just to unpack just a little bit, so what is sufficiency? John D. Rockefeller, when asked how much is enough, repeatedly said just a little bit more. Sufficiency is realizing God gives enough, but we need to ensure that all have adequate access to what they need for their basic needs, and that in the choices we make in election, we look for the policies and the platforms that are going to seek the good of all, not just of a few. Solidarity is, that we stand not with human communities, but also with the whole created order. And so we see a lot about sustainability in our environmental statement, of course, but also in the statement on sexism, and how sexism across generations, has led into policies and practices that have, mired women in particular in poverty, and sometimes, and so to ensure sustainability for future generations, we have to tackle the policies that prevent women from receiving equal pay, for example. Or in the racism, race, ethnicity, and culture statement, we have to confront racism if we're to build a sustainable society where diversity is truly valued. Solidarity is, again, standing alongside those who are suffering, that we are our brothers and sisters and siblings keeper. And participation is ensuring that everyone has a chance for their voice to be heard. And that as a community of moral deliberation, we have to value and respect everyone in our community, but also be able to have the tough conversations. I'm going to pause right now and say, what's one way that we actively use social teaching in the ELCA's work today? And that is through corporate social responsibility. And so I'd like to invite Kari to unmute and come on.
Hello.
Hello, Kari.
Amy.
So Pastor Kari Ryerson is our program director for corporate social responsibility, and she is as versed in social teaching as anybody I know, having been part of working on different social statements and social messages. But in your current incarnation of ministry, tell us, what is corporate social responsibility and why does the ELCA do it?
Corporate social responsibility, to quote our about CSR material, corporate social responsibility in the ELCA uses the tools of screening of investments, shareholder advocacy, and community investing to work with corporations, calling them to ensure that people are treated fairly and with dignity, and to create sustainable communities. So our means, recommended screening of investments, shareholder advocacy, i.e. dialogues and shareholder resolutions, and positive investing, encouraging money to be put in ways that will impact the world positively. Our goals are human dignity, individually and corporately, and a sustainable world. In terms of the why, I can talk more in depth about kind of the theological undergirding, but in a very practical sense, it's in our Constitution. in numerous ways. We are commanded to do it by our Constitution, and it's specifically named in economic life, human rights, environment, and climate care. The ELCA is an institution that has investments through pension funds, endowment, and foundation, and we need to think about how to align our investments with our values.
So what does social teaching have to do with CSR, corporate social responsibility?
Glad you asked. Um, One of my favorite quotes is actually from the Economic Life Statement. It says, God's reign intersects earthly life, transforming us and how we view the systems of this world. Our faith in God provides a vantage point for critiquing any and every system of this world, all of which fall short of what God intends. Human impoverishment, excessive accumulation, and consumerism driven by greed, gross economic disparities, and the degradation of nature are incompatible with this reign of God. So our social statements say we have this vision of what God intends for humanity. And we get to critique our social systems, all of them, on the basis of that vision, because we say we know that God intends for us to live in peace. We know that God intends for all of us to receive our daily bread. And so we critique systems on the basis of that. Do they serve our neighbor or do they not serve our neighbor? It's not kind of an ideological, political thing. Is this system, which we know is fallible and incomplete, is it serving our neighbor? How can we shape it to serve our neighbor?
So CSR is one other avenue in which we can love our neighbor, uh, not through policy and politics, but through influencing the behavior of corporations, who, of course, have enormous influence and impact globally on people's lives and well-being, as well as that of creation. So you've done a lot of work with ELCA social teaching. In fact, maybe just tell us your background in that a little bit, but and then tell us, once the ELCA actually had to create a piece of social teaching to support the work of CSR based on a churchwide assembly action. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I have an MDiv, a Master of Divinity, and also an MA in International Relations. And I studied economics and public policy in graduate school. And I have a son named Gustav, who's named after numerous Gustavs, one of which is my development economics professor from graduate school, because I just thought he was a really cool guy. Um, but So I started at the ELCA in the Department for Studies, which in what was then the Department for Studies, and we wrote social teaching. So I started working on commercial sexual exploitation. I worked on the education message. I worked on criminal justice. I did work on sexuality. So I worked in the department doing a number of working on these social teachings, and I also founded something called the Journal of Lutheran Ethics. I was the founding editor. Um, I I I was laid off, and then I came back actually on contract to write more social teaching. And I happened to intersect with my future work again, um, because in 2016, their churchwide assembly was asked to develop a human rights social criteria investment screen out of concern about the justice of investing in the Holy Land. So when we talk to porticos, socially responsible funds, about what they should and shouldn't invest in, the first place we start is, what does our social teaching say about this? How are we going to describe what we want Portico to do or not to do, or anyone who's following our social teaching? So this resolution was passed in 2016 to develop a screen with special attentions to the concern of ELCA's strategy when it comes to the Holy Land, but it was meant to be about human rights overall. So corporate social responsibility talked to now theological discernment, and they said, you really need a stronger basis in our screens to bridge off of to give Portico any kind of direction. We need to kind of gather it in one place. So I was actually contracted, and I happened to, in my graduate studies, major in human rights. I was actually contracted to write develop a human rights message. And I was able to do that out of predecessor church body teachings and current ELCA teaching. And I use the themes of sufficiency, sustainability, solidarity, and participation, along with human dignity, to describe how the ELCA could proceed based on its predecessor church bodies and current social teaching to approach the issue of human rights. With that message in hand, then, human rights, political and civil rights screen was written. There are 2 international covenants on human rights, one on political, civil, another on cultural and social. The current screen only applies to one. It's in the process of being rewritten to be more broad, actually. And the proposed revision will kind of cover all the categories as described in our social teaching. So for corporate social responsibility to make this move, even though it was directed by the church-wide assembly, we want you to screen out these things, we still had to talk to our theologians and say, like, what does our social teaching allow us to do? And what does it direct us to do? How does it help us understand this issue? On what basis are we screening things out? Why are we screening things in as well? Are we encouraging investments in certain things? And so eventually the screen was passed. But in the meantime, this social message is used by my colleagues in federal advocacy at the Lutheran Office for the UN and also in corporate social responsibility. It's kind of, CSR kind of connects all these different aspects of the church: the legislative, the theological, the financial, the advocacy, and the public witness.
Thank you, Kari. So these screens, they're developed and they can be used by individuals to say, do I want to invest? How do I want to target my investments, and what do I want to steer clear of? What's going to go through the screen and pass? And where do I not want to invest? But we also use them institutionally, and we also use them. They influence in our partnership with Portico Benefit Services. Can you say a bit how that works?
Sure. And I think another important aspect of the screen is it articulates the ethical argument from the basis of theology, not just like, what are we doing, but why are we doing it? It connects our faith to our decisions. So we, as part of my job is helping write these screens that then go to Portico, and Portico has a kind of socially responsible committee that oversees its socially responsible funds. Portico has 2 different streams of funds. One is not considered socially responsible. They have to offer that. They're a pension fund. They have to offer this option. And the other is socially responsible funds that are not invested in very harmful military weapons. They're not invested in alcohol. They're not invested in private prisons, for example. And so Portico uses this and uses information from their research company to decide who meets these standards of what they want to invest in and who really doesn't meet the standard of what they want to invest in. It's a very kind of arduous and exhaustive process, but it really does has kept them out of private prisons, which have been, not for very good reasons, not having very good press lately. And so it does really change the nature of these socially responsible funds to use these screens.
Yeah, and we're very pleased. Portico, a few years ago now, the default for folks coming into that system is to automatically be enrolled in the social purpose investments. And I think that's a wonderful baseline for the church. I should say, for those who are not familiar, Portico Benefit Services provides benefits for ELCA rostered leaders, church staff, and ELCA affiliated institutions. So there's all this activity. We use social teaching. We create screens to help guide investment. These screens are all available on the ELCA website right now. There's going to be some location changes, so we may need to give guidance about where you can find them in a couple weeks. So anyone can access them. My own congregation had not been using screen funds, had not been thinking in that way about their investments, but has begun to gave them to our investment manager, and those are now being employed just for our own congregation as one way that we work to witness to God's love and on behalf of our neighbor. But here's the thing, Kari. Does our puny little investments in these bazillion dollar corporations, does it really change anything?
Great question. I have an example from today, actually. I was speaking with, I'm at the meeting of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and it's a collection of mainline Protestant denominations, a bunch of amazing Catholic sisters, and then kind of advocacy groups that drift in and out. That form the basis of it, and they work together on issues of corporate responsibility. And one of my Presbyterian colleagues, their kind of equivalent to ELCA CSR, was directed by their churchwide, or their equivalent of the churchwide assembly, I think that's their general assembly, to look into 3 gun sellers and ask about, are you selling guns in store? Are you asking for background checks? Are you asking for ID? Like all these, questions. And he went to all 3 of them. He was Dick's, Walmart, and something else. And he said they said, "Oh, don't worry, the ICCR and the Catholic Sisters have already been here. We either don't sell them in store, they're under lock and key." They had all of these questions that the Synod Assembly had asked had already been dealt with by the ICCR members and ICCR, because especially these Catholic sisters, man, they go for years and years and years, and they work on dialogues with companies for years and years and years, and they get to know everybody. They bring people together. It's really, really impressive what this long-standing relationship can be. There definitely big victories, like Keurig committed to like assessing their plastic reuse and refill and conduct new pilots in 2024. BlackRock, Netflix, Next Era are going to disclose quantitative median gender pay gaps. Norfolk Southern became the first major North American freight railroad to give paid sick time to union workers. So the ICCR and the community works on a lot of climate, some things like paid sick leave. I mean, it's just horrifying that in this country, we don't have paid sick leave. And if you think about what happened in COVID, when people people were supposed to show up to work with this incredibly contagious disease, I think that really brought into sharp relief, like, it makes sense to have paid sick leave. It is kind of silly not to. But we often help nudge corporations over that. A lot of what they do is get corporations to share info. So sometimes when Portico, for example, needs to figure out whether they should screen somebody, that information is just not available because the corporation doesn't want to disclose it because they know it's not great news. And it's often a signal that something is going to be going wrong down the road. We ask questions about their future health as well. Like, are you a good fiduciary of your company's business? If you're in a certain kind of business that is heavily polluting, what are you going to do in 10 years? And is there going to be public backlash? Is there going to be legislative backlash? Have you thought that through? So a lot of what we do is get corporations to disclose information, to do a survey, do some research, and disclose that information so investors can make better decisions. So I think we make a lot of difference. It's just maybe on a kind of incremental level, and it might be a little, you might need to kind of know the landscape to know what the effect is.
Thank you, Kari. There's probably a lot more to be said, but I'm seeing
Questions?
chat questions come up. So if we could hear a couple of those.
Sure. Okay, it looks like we have some questions about whether the ELCA Foundation and Thrivent also use those screeners.
ELCA Foundation does. And then, yes, I don't work with Thrivent, so I can't comment on Thrivent.
That's something you could ask your Thrivent representative.
Exactly.
Great. Let's see. We also have a question about how to learn more about your work. Is there any way that people can follow along with what you're doing?
If only the website hadn't been reorganized last week, it would be a little easier. I think Karen put a link in. I should probably wear reading glasses. I think she put a link into the chat.
Yeah.
Um,
And we
although,
do use our social media channels to announce when a new resource has been released. That's one way we can share it. There is not a unique newsletter for corporate social responsibility work, etc., but we do on occasion use other communication tools from advocacy to share that information.
You'll say, and there have been some Living Lutheran articles over the years.
Yeah.
I think there's even one with a study guide of, if I'm remembering correctly, from not too long ago. But it is not terribly visible in the LCA, and even though it touches, every rostered leader. Or is available to every rostered leaders as they make their own choices in congregations, and we'd love to see the screens used and applied, as one way we can be disciples.
and I'd like to note that the kind of movement against ESG, environmental social governance, which is investing, which is a lot of what I'm doing, is also coming about. So participants in the Climate Action 100 group were subject to a kind of a threatening letter. They had to respond with kind of more information about what they were doing in terms of climate advocacy. One place to kind of keep an eye on news would be iccr.org. The ICCR is kind of the clearinghouse for the work of the mainline Protestant denominations and the super active Catholic sisters, and they the strength in numbers. They hire lawyers to give us legal opinions. They sponsor sign-on letters. They do a lot of that work, and that might be something to follow as well. Thank you, Karen. Karen has everything at her. This is amazing. Thank you, Karen.
Anything else, Chelsea?
One more does the ELCA know how many congregations use all of the social documents and resources?
Funny you should ask that, because there is right now there is a redo of how the ELCA resources are shared, and in the old the way the website currently is, if you download a resource, it's not tracked. I may be over promising. I think now there's going to be a tracking system, but things are being shuffled in real time, and so a lot of resources that we may have actually send you links to in the first session, we're going to just have to be testing everything to make sure people can still get to stuff. It's going to be a little confusing for a while, so apologies in advance if that happens to you. Yeah, so we don't know, but we can hear anecdotally about how things are being used. I run into rostered leaders, congregational leaders who talk about how they have used them. We get inquiries all the time. What does the ELCA say about blank? You say, well, as a matter of fact, we have a whole statement on that. But they're only going to be used, of course, if they are taken out and used to inform preaching, congregational study, communal moral discernment, and that we take the time to do that together. And in busy lives, sometimes that's not what gets scheduled in, but and we're always alert for ways that congregations are using them.
Great. Bishop Satterley just has a comment that Augsburg Fortress is putting out a new book series about each social statement with commentary for discussion. They actually sent us one, so we have it here. It's for the Church and Society statement, but those are great for discussion too. I guess he reviewed the first one, so.
Yeah, and then there are study guides for the statements. Some of them were produced a long time ago. Others, several have really very recent study guides that have video components. The Faith, Sexism, and Justice has a really great video accompanying series to the curriculum. The Peace Statement has a brand new one. And the climate crisis social message also has a really nice new study guide. And so those make it much more accessible because, these are pretty dense with a lot of small print. And so I think the more we can do to make it accessible to people with different learning styles and ways to approach them, the better. So maybe just to put a bow on things for tonight, there's only so much we can do to talk about social teaching in an hour, and we can't even really get into depth in any one statement. So maybe these books can be a way for the Synod to move ahead on that together. But these resources are available as we, look to the elections. Again, individually by issue. What does our social teaching say as you look at whether it's your local candidates or national election, to ask questions or to seek guidance for that. It gives us affirmation of the role of the church at this time, and really encourages that community of moral discernment together, not just before the election, but also after it, as we see what the consequences are for the makeup of local and national government, and all the policy conversations and all the ways we can love our neighbor through advocacy in the 4 years after this. So I see the comment on the social statement on abortion. It's the interest in that certainly rose. I wish we had the download numbers, following the Dobbs decision. United Lutheran Seminary has been doing a series on social teaching in the election, and there was a whole session on our social teaching on abortion that I was unable to attend. I don't know if that's just available to look at, but even though it's one of the first ones, right, 1991, and but it's still one that we need to turn to as decisions continue to get made. So to prepare for next week we're diving into the topic of government. Not a small topic. We looked at the process for the social statement on faith and civic life. We're going to be dipping into that a bit and looking at our US system of government. And while the social teaching is still in formation, I think there's some indications in there of what's ahead, for us, certainly in the large themes that are there, even though some of the wording and final version will look different. Our special guest next week is going to be Mr. Isaiah Todoridich, who is the head of LWF, Lutheran World Federation, Action for Justice team. He is their head of advocacy. And so we're also going to talk about, while we're focusing mainly on the US government and our Lutheran theology, there are Lutheran churches around the world who operate in different kinds of social societies and interact with different kinds of government. And we're going to learn a little bit. Are there some common themes as we look at world Lutheranism and our witness in different places? And what's the same? What's different? What can we learn from one another?